They mocked the Wolfless Omega at the Alpha King's tournament until her pet revealed its true form. Is that a rat, or did her coat shed its lining? The jeer sliced through the crisp autumn air, followed by the jagged laughter of the elite. Vespera didn't flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on the muddy cobblestones of the arena entrance, her grip tightening on the frayed rope leash. At the other end of the twine, the creature, a hairless, trembling lump of grey flesh with oversized ears and mismatched eyes, let out a pathetic, wheezing sneeze. "Careful, Your Highness," a guard sneered, shoving Vespera forward with the butt of his spear. "The Omega brings a fierce beast to the slaughter." Vespera patted the creature's wrinkled head. "Ignore them, Grizz," she whispered, her voice steel-wrapped in velvet. They don't know that monsters rarely look like monsters until it's too late. The invitation to the Alpha King's tournament was not an honor. For Vespera, it was a death sentence printed on vellum. In the hierarchy of the Blackwood Pack, Vespera was less than a ghost. She was the mistake. Born to high-ranking parents who had promptly discarded her when she failed to shift by her 16th birthday, she had spent the last 4 years scrubbing the scullery floors and tending to the sick who were too poor to afford a healer. She was 20 now, wolfless, a genetic dead end in a society that worshipped the Fang. The only thing she had was Grizz. She had found him 3 winters ago, half frozen in a snowdrift near the perimeter fence. He was hideous by any standard, a runt with too many joints, skin that felt like warm leather, and a tail that looked like a whip. He didn't bark, he clicked. He didn't eat meat, he ate ash from the fireplace, and, occasionally, rusted metal. The pack youth threw stones at him. The elders called him an omen. Vespera called him the only living thing that didn't look at her with pity. "You don't have to go," old Marnie, the cook, whispered as Vespera packed her meager satchel. The kitchen smelled of stale grease and despair. "Hide in the cellar. I'll tell them you died of the pox." Vespera shook her head, tightening the laces of her worn boots. "King Malachi's guards have a list, Marnie. If I'm not there, they burn the sector. I won't let Blackwood suffer for my absence." "It's a culling, Ves," Marnie hissed, gripping Vespera's arm. "The Sovereign isn't looking for a mate. The rumors say the Shadow Blight is returning. He's looking for fodder. Bait." "Then I'll be bait that's hard to swallow." Vespera looked down at Grizz. The creature was currently chewing on the leg of a cast-iron stool, his jaw unhinging slightly to accommodate the metal. He paused, looked up with his one blue eye and one gold eye, and let out a chittering sound that vibrated in Vespera's chest. The journey to the capital, High Hearth, took 3 days by carriage. Vespera shared the ride with 4 other unmated females from neighboring territories. They were beautiful, glowing with vitality, their inner wolves preening just beneath their skin. They wore silks and velvets. Vespera wore a tunic stitched from grey wool and a cloak that had seen better decades. "Why is it here?" asked Lysandra, a stunning beta from the Riverlands, wrinkling her nose at Grizz, who was curled in Vespera's lap, looking like a gargoyle. "Emotional support," Vespera lied smoothly. "It smells like ozone," Lysandra muttered, leaning away. "And old blood." Vespera stroked Grizz's spine. The creature was hot to the touch, feverishly so. Since the invitation arrived, Grizz had been changing. His skin was darkening, the grey turning to a deep, bruising charcoal. He slept less. He watched more, and when the carriage passed the ancient boundary stones of the capital, Grizz sat up and hissed, a sound not like an animal, but like a kettle boiling over. "Hush," Vespera soothed, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. She looked out the window as the onyx citadel came into view. It was a fortress of black stone, jutting out of the mountain like a jagged tooth. The world of the wolves was brutal, governed by strength and bloodlines. Vespera had survived by being invisible. But as the carriage rolled through the iron gates, and the scent of thousands of aggressive, posturing wolves hit her, she knew invisibility was no longer an option. She was walking into the lion's den, armed only with a sharp tongue and a pet that ate furniture. The grand hall of the Onyx Citadel was designed to make one feel small. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows, and the floor was polished obsidian, reflecting the hundreds of anxious faces staring up at the dais. There were 50 contestants. 49 of them were shifting nervously, their inner wolves reacting to the crushing aura of the sovereign. Vespera stood perfectly still. Being Wolfless had one advantage. Alpha commands rolled off her like water off oil. She felt the pressure, a headache building behind her eyes, but she didn't feel the urge to kneel. Grizz sat at her heel, looking particularly pathetic. He scratched his ear with a hind leg, looking bored. Presenting His Majesty, Sovereign Malachi, King of all clans, Warden of the North. The doors blasted open. The silence was absolute. Malachi did not walk. He prowled. He was terrifyingly beautiful, in the way a thunderstorm is beautiful before it destroys your home. He wore no crown, only a simple tunic of black leather that did nothing to hide the lethal power coiling in his muscles. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. He sat on the throne, slouching slightly, resting his chin on a fist. He looked bored. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Malachi said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "The oracle speaks of a threat rising from the void. I do not need a wife to warm my bed. I need a queen who can endure the dark. If you are weak, leave now. If you stay and die, your blood is on your own hands." No one moved. To leave was to disgrace one's pack. "Very well," Malachi waved a hand. "The first assessment is simple. Show me your beasts." It began. One by one, the women stepped forward and shifted. The hall filled with the sounds of cracking bone and tearing fabric. Magnificent wolves appeared, russet, snow-white, timber-brown. They howled, posturing, showing off their glossy coats and sharp teeth. Malachi watched them with the enthusiasm of a man watching paint dry. Then it was Vespera's turn. She stepped forward. She did not shift. She couldn't. The silence in the hall stretched, thick and awkward. "Well?" Malachi asked, his eyes narrowing. "I cannot shift, Your Majesty," Vespera said, her voice clear. A ripple of laughter went through the court. Lord Theon, a massive alpha from the Southern Isles, stepped forward from the king's guard. "A Wolfless? In the sovereign's court? This is an insult, sire. She is a defect." "I am Vespera of Blackwood," she continued, ignoring Theon. "And while I have no wolf, I am not without bite." "And that?" Malachi gestured a lazy finger toward Grizz. "Is that your champion?" The laughter grew louder. Lysandra, in her human form again, covered her mouth to hide a giggle. "It's a rodent, Your Majesty. She keeps it as a pet." "It's hideous," Theon spat. He walked toward Vespera, his intent clear. Intimidation. He released his full alpha aura, a wave of dominance that dropped half the room to their knees. Vespera stood firm, though her knees shook. Theon sneered, leaning down into her face. "Kneel, defect, before I snap you like a twig." Grizz stood up. It was a small movement. The creature trotted forward, placing himself between Vespera's legs and the massive alpha. Grizz looked up at Theon, tilted his head, and opened his mouth. No sound came out. Instead, the torches nearest to them flickered and died. The shadows under the throne lengthened, stretching across the floor like spilling ink. Theon paused, frowning. "Move, rat!" He kicked out, aiming to punt the creature across the hall. Crunch! It happened too fast for the human eye to follow. One moment, Theon's boot was connecting with Grizz. The next, Theon was howling, stumbling back. Grizz hadn't moved an inch, but Theon's steel-toed combat boot was crushed, the metal flattened as if it had been clamped in a hydraulic press. The hall went deathly silent. Grizz sat down, licked a speck of dust from his paw, and looked at the king. Malachi slowly sat up straight. The boredom vanished from his eyes, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. He looked from the whimpering Alpha Guard to the tiny, ugly grey creature, and then, finally, to Vespera. "What is that?" Malachi asked softly. "His name is Grizz," Vespera said, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. She hadn't seen Grizz do anything. He had just stood there. "Grizz," Malachi repeated. He stood up and walked down the steps of the dais. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He stopped 2 feet from Vespera. He smelled of rain and iron. He was overwhelming. He ignored Vespera and looked down at the creature. Grizz looked back, unblinking. "You have a strange shadow, Vespera of Blackwood," Malachi murmured. He reached out a hand. "I wouldn't," Vespera warned. Malachi paused. A faint smile, sharp and dangerous, touched his lips. "Intriguing." He withdrew his hand. "You stay. The rest of you. Try not to disappoint me tomorrow." The accommodations for the contestants were lavish, but Vespera was given a room in the servants' wing, a deliberate slight by the palace steward. It suited her fine. It was quiet, and the stone walls were thick. "What did you do?" Vespera hissed, pacing the small room. Grizz was currently on the bed, shredding a silk pillow with methodical precision. He paused, a feather sticking out of his mouth, and gave her a look of utter innocence. "You broke an alpha's foot without touching him. The torches died. The king—" Vespera stopped. She sank onto the edge of the bed. "The king looked at you like he recognized you." Grizz hopped into her lap. His body was heavier now, denser. When she ran her hand over his back, the skin felt different, harder, like scales forming under the velvet flesh. "We have to survive tomorrow," she whispered, burying her face in his neck. "If we survive, I'll find a way to get us home." The next morning, the first trial was announced. It wasn't a duel. It was a hunt. The contestants were brought to the edge of the Iron Weald, a dense, fog-choked forest that bordered the Void Lands. "The rules are simple," declared Silas, the king's beta, a man with eyes like polished flint. "There are 3 silver stags released into the woods. Catch one and you move to the next round. Return empty-handed, and you go home." "And if we are attacked?" Lysandra asked, eyeing the dark tree line. "Then you bleed," Silas said with a shrug. "The Weald is not safe. There are things that cross the border. Show us you are worthy of being a queen. A queen protects." The horn blew. 49 wolves shifted and tore into the forest, a wave of fur and muscle. Vespera adjusted her satchel, checked the knife in her boot, and started walking. "Come on, Grizz." They moved off the main path immediately. Vespera knew she couldn't outrun a wolf, and she certainly couldn't outrun a stag. She had to outthink them. She tracked the wind, moving downwind to hide her scent. 2 hours in, the forest changed. The birds stopped singing. The fog turned a sickly yellow. Vespera froze. The silence wasn't natural. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. A scream pierced the air. It was close. Vespera ran toward it, instinct overriding self-preservation. She burst into a small clearing to find Lysandra backed against an ancient oak tree. The beautiful wolf was in human form now, bleeding from a gash on her arm, clutching a broken branch. Circling her was not a stag. It was a void leech, a creature of nightmare, resembling a giant eyeless centipede made of oil and teeth, roughly the size of a horse. It chittered, mandibles clicking, tasting the air. "Help me!" Lysandra shrieked, seeing Vespera. "Do something!" Vespera pulled her knife, though she knew it was useless against a void beast. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice trembling. The leech lunged, not at Lysandra, but at the motion, at Vespera. Vespera braced herself for the impact, raising her arm to shield her face. Screech, a blur of grey shot past her legs. Grizz hit the void leech mid-air. It was physics-defying. Grizz was the size of a large cat. The leech was massive. But when they collided, the leech was the one that went flying, slamming into a tree with the force of a cannonball. Grizz landed on the forest floor, and then he grew. It wasn't a shift. It was an unfolding. His skin split down the back, and shadows poured out like smoke. The runty legs elongated, thick muscle knitting together instantly. The hairless tail erupted into a lash of obsidian spikes. For a second, the form was indistinct, a cloud of darkness and rage. Then, it solidified. Standing between Vespera and the monster was not a dog, nor a wolf. It was a hound, but one made of nightmares. It stood shoulder-height to a man, sleek and black, with a mane of writhing smoke. Its eyes were no longer mismatched. They were both burning, molten gold. The void leech hissed and scrambled to recover, but the hound, Grizz, opened a mouth filled with rows of crystalline teeth and let out a roar that didn't sound like sound at all. It sounded like the earth cracking open. The leech turned and fled, skittering into the darkness in pure terror. Grizz turned back to Vespera. The smoke around him settled. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. Lysandra had fainted. Vespera stared at the beast that had slept at the foot of her bed for 3 years. "Grizz?" she whispered. The massive, terrifying shadow beast chuffed, a familiar clicking sound in his throat. He lowered his massive head and nudged Vespera's hand with a wet nose, leaving a streak of black soot on her palm. "Well?" A deep voice came from the trees behind them. Vespera spun around. King Malachi leaned against a pine tree, his arms crossed, watching them. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. "I haven't seen a shadow stalker in 300 years, the king said, pushing off the tree and walking toward them. The massive beast that was Grizz growled low in his throat, stepping in front of Vespera. Malachi stopped, raising his hands in mock surrender. "And never one that bonded to a human." He looked at Vespera, his gaze heavy and intense. "You aren't Wolfless, Vespera. You are something else entirely. And I think the game just changed." The walk back to the citadel was a study in altered realities. Before the hunt, Vespera had been the invisible Omega, the dirt beneath the boots of the elite. Now she was the eye of a hurricane. King Malachi did not order her guards to arrest her. He did not command Grizz to be caged. Instead, he walked beside Vespera, his stride long and relaxed, while Grizz, now returned to his smaller, deceptive gargoyle form, trotted at her heels, occasionally burping up a wisp of black smoke. The other contestants trailed behind, a huddled mass of bruised egos and terrified whispers. Lysandra, pale and shaking, kept shooting glances at Vespera, her expression a chaotic mix of fear and awe. When they reached the citadel gates, the steward was waiting with a sneer that vanished the moment he saw the king's face. "Sire, the Omega's quarters in the servant wing are—" "Burn them," Malachi interrupted, his voice bored but carrying a terrifying weight. "She stays in the obsidian tower, the onyx suite." The steward choked. "Sire? The onyx suite is reserved for high-ranking dignitaries, for the Alpha Prime's own kin." "She stays," Malachi said, stopping to look down at Vespera, "where I can keep an eye on her." The onyx suite was larger than the entire house Vespera had grown up in. It had a balcony overlooking the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Mountains, a bathtub carved from a single piece of dark jade, and a bed covered in furs that probably cost more than a village. Vespera stood in the center of the room, feeling absurdly out of place in her mud-stained wool tunic. Grizz immediately jumped onto the velvet chaise lounge and began chewing on a gold tassel. "Stop that!" Vespera sighed, collapsing onto the bed. "We're in enough trouble." On the contrary, a voice drifted from the doorway. Trouble is usually far less interesting. Vespera scrambled up. Malachi was leaning against the doorframe. He had changed into a loose silk shirt, the top buttons undone, revealing an expanse of pale, scarred skin. He held 2 crystal goblets of dark red wine. He walked in, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He offered her a glass. "I don't drink with executioners," Vespera said, her chin high. Malachi laughed, a low, rasping sound. "I'm not your executioner, Vespera. If I wanted you dead, I would have let the leech have you. Drink. It's a vintage from the Southern Isles. It calms the nerves." Vespera took the glass, but didn't drink. "What is he?" She nodded toward Gris. Malachi took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "He is a shadow stalker, a creature from the lore of the First Age. They were the hunting hounds of the Void Walkers, ancient warriors who guarded the tear between our world and the darkness." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "They went extinct 1,000 years ago, or so we thought." "He was freezing in a snowbank," Vespera whispered. "He was dying." "He was waiting," Malachi corrected. "Shadowstalkers do not bond with wolves. They find the scent of the void. They bond with those who carry the echo of the abyss in their blood." He stepped closer, the air in the room growing heavy with the scent of ozone and rain. "Tell me, Vespera, who are your parents?" "Alpha Kyle and Luna Mara of Blackwood," she recited automatically. "High-ranking, strong bloodlines." "And yet," Malachi murmured, circling her, "you have no wolf. You are immune to Alpha Command. And a monster from legends treats you like a mother." He stopped behind her, his breath stirring the hair at her nape. "I think, little Omega, that you are not a mistake. I think you are a weapon that was hidden in plain sight." Vespera turned to face him, her heart pounding against her ribs. Not from fear, but from a strange, magnetic pull she hadn't expected. "And what does the king do with weapons?" Malachi's eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "He sharpens them. By the next evening, the entire citadel knew. The rumors had mutated, as rumors do. Some said Vespera was a witch who had summoned a demon. Others claimed she was the king's secret assassin." The second event of the tournament was a grand banquet. It sounded harmless, but Vespera knew better. In the Court of Wolves, a dinner party was just a battlefield with better cutlery. She wore a dress Malachi had sent, a sleek, midnight blue gown that fit like a second skin, with a high collar and a back that plunged dangerously low. It was armor masquerading as fashion. Gris, to the horror of the court, attended as well. He wore a small, diamond-encrusted collar that Vespera suspected was a joke from the king. As Vespera entered the dining hall, the conversation died. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto her. "Sit with us," a voice hissed. Vespera blinked. Lysandra was waving her over to a table near the front. The beautiful Beta looked different, less haughty, more shaken. Her arm was bandaged where the leech had grazed her. Vespera hesitated, then sat. "Why?" Vespera asked quietly, arranging her napkin. "Because," Lysandra whispered, pouring wine with a trembling hand. "That thing, your pet, saved my life when I froze. And because Theon is looking at you like he wants to mount your head on his wall." Vespera glanced across the room. Lord Theon sat at the king's table, his foot heavily bandaged and propped up on a stool. His face was a mask of cold fury. Next to him sat Lady Alara, a striking redhead from the Fire Clans who was currently the favorite to win. "He's humiliated," Lysandra murmured. "An alpha brought low by a pet? He won't let it stand." The dinner progressed. Courses of roasted elk, spiced root vegetables, and honeyed cakes were served. Vespera ate carefully, tasting everything for bitterness. "A toast!" Theon bellowed suddenly, struggling to his feet. The hall quieted. He raised his goblet, his eyes locking onto Vespera. To the kings. Amusement. May we all find entertainment in the smallest of things. It was a thinly veiled insult. The court tittered nervously. Malachika, seated at the head of the high table, didn't smile. He twirled his wine glass, watching Theon with the detachment of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. And to the Omega, Theon continued, his voice dropping an octave, who brings a parasite to a gathering of kings? Tell me, girl, does it do tricks, or does it just eat garbage? Grizz, who was currently under the table gnawing on a discarded bone, stopped. Vespera stood up. The silence was deafening. He does one trick, Lord Theon, she said, her voice carrying clear across the hall. He reveals the true nature of things. For example, he showed us that your alpha roar is louder than your courage. Gasps rang out. No one spoke to a high lord that way. Theon's face turned purple. You insolent! Enough, Malachi said. He didn't shout, but the word slammed into the room like a physical weight. Theon sat down, seething. A servant approached Vespera's table, placing a small, ornate dish of custard in front of her. Compliments of Lady Alara, the servant mumbled, bowing low. Vespera looked at Alara. The redhead offered a sweet, tight smile. Vespera picked up her spoon. Click. Grizz shot out from under the table, leaping onto the tablecloth. He landed with a splash in the custard, scattering silver and crystal. Grizz! Vespera scolded. But Grizz didn't look guilty. He lowered his head and began to lap up the custard with frantic speed. Oh God, get it away! Lysandra shrieked, recoiling. Grizz finished the bowl in seconds. He sat back, licked his chops, and then he burped. A cloud of purple vapor erupted from his mouth. It wasn't smoke. It was magical residue. Nightshade, Malachi said from the high table. He was standing now. Concentrated nightshade essence, enough to kill 20 men. The hall erupted into chaos. Grizz looked at Alara. He let out a happy chirrup, his eyes glowing. To a shadow stalker, poison wasn't a threat. It was a spice. Malachi walked down the dais steps, moving with lethal grace. He stopped at Vespera's table. He looked at the empty bowl, then at Lady Alara. Guards, Malachi said softly. Take Lady Alara to the dungeons, and fetch the interrogation specialists. I want to know who gave her the poison. Alara screamed as she was dragged away, kicking and pleading innocence. Malachi turned to Vespera. He reached out and wiped a speck of custard from her cheek with his thumb. The intimacy of the gesture silenced the room more effectively than a shout. It seems, he murmured, that your diet is rubbing off on him, or perhaps he just has a taste for toxicity. He likes spicy food, Vespera managed, her legs shaking. Good, Malachi said, because things are about to get very hot. The attempted poisoning changed the atmosphere of the tournament, from competitive to predatory. The pretense of civility was gone. 2 days later, the third trial was announced. It was early. The blood moon, a rare celestial event where the moon turned the color of rusted iron, was rising that night. The oracle claims the veil is thin tonight, Silas announced to the remaining 30 contestants gathered in the courtyard. The void is restless. Tonight, we do not hunt beasts. We hunt truth. The trial was simple in description, horrific in practice. The contestants were to enter the Mirror of Souls, a cavern deep beneath the citadel where the raw magic of the earth converged. There, they would face a manifestation of their own bloodline's power. Wolves derive power from the pack, Malachi explained, pacing before the line of women. But a queen must stand alone. If your mind breaks in the cavern, you will be retrieved. If you endure, you ascend. He stopped in front of Vespera. He wore armor tonight, black steel etched with runes. You have no wolf to manifest, he said quietly. The mirror might show you nothing. or it might show you something that will shatter your mind. You can withdraw, and let Theon win." Vespera tightened the straps of her leather jerkin. "I'll take my chances." She entered the cavern. The air inside was cold and smelled of ozone. The walls were lined with crystals that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat. Vespera walked until the tunnel opened into a vast, circular chamber. In the center was a pool of still, black water. She approached the edge. "Show me," she whispered. The water rippled. She expected to see her parents, or perhaps the wolf she never had. Instead, the water turned a violent, swirling violet. An image formed. It was a woman. She looked like Vespera, but older, her eyes completely black, her skin etched with glowing purple veins. She stood on a mountain of bones, holding a leash. At the end of the leash were 3 massive shadow stalkers, each the size of a house. "Daughter of the Eclipse," the reflection spoke, not with sound, but inside Vespera's head. "The gate is closed, but you are the key." Pain exploded in Vespera's skull. She fell to her knees, clutching her head. The reflection reached out a hand from the water. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the chamber. Real. Human. Vespera scrambled back, breaking the trance. The water settled. Across the chamber, Lysandra was writhing on the ground, clawing at invisible enemies. Her own shadow had risen up and was strangling her. "Lysandra!" Vespera scrambled to her feet. "Don't interfere!" Theon's voice boomed. He stepped out from behind a stalagmite. He looked wrong. His eyes were bloodshot, the veins in his neck bulging black. He held a jagged dagger made of bone. "The weak are culled. That is the law. The trial is to face yourself, not kill each other," Vespera shouted. "The king wants a queen who can endure the dark," Theon slurred, his voice layered with a strange, buzzing distortion. "I will give him a corpse." He lunged at Vespera. She didn't have a weapon. She raised her hands instinctively. Click hiss. Grizz was there. He hadn't been allowed in the cavern, but somehow he was there. He erupted from Vespera's own shadow, a mass of teeth and fury. He slammed into Theon, knocking the Alpha back. But Theon didn't fall like a man. He twisted in mid-air, landing on all fours, his bones cracking and reshaping. He wasn't shifting into a wolf. He was shifting into something else. His fur sprouted in patchy clumps, weeping black oil. His jaw split, mandibles bursting from his cheeks. "Void touched," Vespera gasped. Theon wasn't just a jerk. He was infected. The thing that was Theon roared, a sound that shattered the crystals on the walls. He swiped at Grizz, a claw raking across the Shadow Stalker's flank. Grizz yelped, a high, pained sound that tore at Vespera's heart. He tumbled back, bleeding silver light. "No!" Vespera screamed. She didn't think. She felt a surge of heat in her belly, a burning sensation that rushed through her veins like liquid fire. She ran toward Grizz, throwing herself over his small body just as Theon raised his claw for the killing blow. "Stop!" She thrust her hand out. She didn't touch him. She didn't have to. A wave of force erupted from her palm. It was purple, crackling with black lightning. It hit Theon in the chest and blasted him backward with the force of a battering ram. He smashed into the cavern wall, causing the rock to fracture. Silence fell. Vespera stared at her hand. Wisps of violet smoke were curling from her fingertips. Grizz nudged her leg, purring loudly, his wound already knitting together. Slow clapping echoed from the entrance of the cavern. Malachi walked in, his face unreadable, his eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. He looked at the broken form of the void-possessed Theon, then at the terrified Lysandra, and finally at Vespera, who was crowned in fading violet light. "I knew it," Malachi whispered, stopping before her. He dropped to one knee, not in proposal, but in something far more dangerous. He took her smoking hand in his. "The blood of the Void Walkers returns." He looked up at her, a feral grin spreading across his face. Now, the real game begins. The aftermath of the Blood Moon rite was not a celebration. It was a quarantine. Theon, or the abomination that had worn his skin, had been incinerated by the king's own hand shortly after Vespera's blast had incapacitated him. But the ash that remained didn't smell like burnt flesh. It smelled like sulfur and ancient rot. Vespera found herself not in the Onyx Suite, but deep within the bowels of the mountain, in a chamber that didn't appear on any map of the citadel. The walls here weren't stone. They were lined with sheets of smooth, dark metal that hummed with a low vibration. "Stop pacing," Malachi said. He was sitting on a crate of supplies, sharpening a long sword that glowed with a faint blue rune light. "You'll wear a hole in the floor, and we are already deep enough." "You knew," Vespera accused, turning on him. "You knew what I was. You knew Theon was infected. You used the tournament as a sieve." "I suspected," Malachi corrected, testing the blade's edge against his thumb. A bead of blood welled up, bright red against the pale skin. "The void has been leaking into our world for a decade. A slow poison. I needed to know who had the strength to resist it, and who was already hollowed out." Grizz was curled in the center of the room, looking twice his normal size. His skin was shifting, ripples of muscle and shadow, moving beneath the surface like water. He was growing again, preparing. "And my parents?" Vespera asked, her voice trembling. "They treated me like a curse. Did they know?" Malachi stood up, sheathing the sword. The sound was sharp, final. He walked over to her, his presence consuming the space in the small room. He reached out, tilting her chin up so she had to look into those winter sky eyes. "Your parents are fools who fear what they cannot control," he said softly. "The Void Walkers were not wolves. They were the jailers of the abyss. While my ancestors learned to shapeshift to hunt dare and defend territory, yours learned to manipulate the fabric of reality to keep the monsters out. You don't have a wolf, Vespera, because you don't belong to the earth. You belong to the spaces between." He let go of her chin and walked to a large metal panel on the wall. He placed his hand on it. The metal groaned and slid open, revealing a balcony. Vespera gasped. They were inside the main ventilation shaft of the citadel, looking down into the heart of the mountain. Below them, a massive tear in reality pulsated, a jagged wound in the air, glowing with violent violet light. "The seal is breaking," Malachi said, his voice grim. "Tonight wasn't just a trial. It was a catalyst. Theon's transformation was the signal. The army he served is coming." "I don't know how to fight an army," Vespera whispered, stepping back from the dizzying drop. I just pushed. I didn't know what I was doing." "You don't need to know how to fight," Malachi said, turning to her. He stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso mapped with scars, claw marks, burn scars, and brands of old wars. "You need to know how to close the door. I will handle the fighting." He stepped closer, taking her hand and placing it on his chest, right over his heart. It beat slow and powerful, like a war drum. "Connect to it," he commanded. "Not to me, to the energy. The void is hunger. You must be the starvation." For hours they stood there. Malachi, the king of wolves, taught her not how to bite, but how to breathe. He taught her to pull the shadows into herself, to condense them, to turn the fear in her gut into a cold, hard diamond of will. It was intimate in a way that transcended touch. He was giving her the keys to his kingdom's destruction, trusting her not to turn the lock. "They mocked you," Malachi murmured, his lips brushing her ear as she held a ball of crackling purple energy in her palm. "They called you wolfless, empty." Vespera closed her fingers, crushing the energy. It didn't burn. It sang. "I am not empty," she said, her eyes flashing gold, mirroring Grizz's gaze. "No," Malachi agreed, stepping back as alarms suddenly began to blare throughout the citadel. "You are the storm." The attack did not begin with a roar. It began with silence. The alarms cut off abruptly. The lights in the citadel died. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind howling through the peaks of Blackwood. Then, the sky tore open. From the balcony of the war room, Vespera watched as the clouds above the citadel swirled into a funnel. Creatures poured out. Not animals, but geometric nightmares. Spiders made of glass and smoke. Serpents that floated without wings. Giants constructed from the debris of the ruined watchtowers. "Hold the line!" Silas roared from the courtyard below. 300 of the king's elite guard shifted in unison. The sound of bones cracking and fur sprouting was a thunderclap of biology. They charged the gates, a tide of fur and fang meeting a wall of shadow. It was a massacre. Wolf claws passed harmlessly through the smoke bodies of the void beasts. The wolves were tossed aside like rag dolls, their whimpers lost in the screeching of the invaders. "They can't touch them," Vespera said, clutching the stone railing. "Physical attacks don't work." "Mine do," Malachi said. He was fully armored now, holding the rune blade. "But I cannot kill them all. I can only buy you time." He looked at her. There was no fear in his eyes, only a terrifying resolve. "Go to the tear in the mountain. Grizz knows the way. Seal it, Vespera. If you fail, there will be no dawn." He didn't wait for a goodbye. He vaulted over the railing, shifting in mid-air. Malachi's wolf was a monster of legend. He was twice the size of a normal alpha, his fur pure, absorbing black. When he landed in the courtyard, the impact shook the foundations of the tower. He roared, and his rune blade, now clamped in his jaws, flared with blue fire. He tore into the void beasts. Where he bit, the shadows didn't reform. They burned. "Come on," Vespera said to Grizz. They ran. The corridors of the citadel were a war zone. Servants fled screaming as smaller void parasites skittered along the ceilings. Vespera didn't stop. When a cluster of needle-legged crabs blocked the hallway, she didn't flinch. She thrust her hand forward, and a pulse of violet gravity crushed them into a singularity the size of a marble. "I'm getting the hang of this," she muttered, stepping over the remains. They reached the entrance to the lower mines. It was blocked. A massive pile of rubble had fallen across the blast doors. "We're trapped," Vespera panicked, pushing against a boulder that weighed tons. "Not trapped," a voice groaned. Lysandra pulled herself out from behind a pillar. She was bleeding from a head wound, her fine dress in tatters. She held a heavy iron pry bar. "Lysandra?" Vespera blinked. Theon, or the thing that was Theon. "It had friends," Lysandra coughed, spitting blood. "They rigged the entrance. They knew you'd come here." "Get out of here," Vespera said. "It's not safe." Lysandra laughed, a jagged sound. "Nowhere is safe, Omega. But I owe you, for the forest." Lysandra shifted. Her wolf was sleek, golden and fast. She didn't attack the rocks. She jammed the pry bar into a fissure and threw her entire shifting weight against it. "Push!" Vespera yelled. She added her own power, wrapping the rocks in telekinetic force. Together, Wolf and Walker, they heaved. The rubble groaned and gave way, clearing a path just big enough to squeeze through. "Go!" Lysandra panted, reverting to human form, collapsing against the wall. "I'll guard the rear." Vespera looked at the woman who had tormented her for days. "Why?" "Because," Lysandra whispered, closing her eyes. "You're the only one who isn't afraid of the dark." Vespera and Grizz descended. The chamber of the tear was chaos. The rift had widened. The violet light was blinding. Standing before it was a figure. It was Lady Alara. But it wasn't the vain, ambitious girl from the banquet. She was floating 3 feet off the ground, her back arched, black tendrils connecting her spine to the rift. She was the conduit. "She's the anchor," Grizz spoke. Vespera froze. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak English. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Grizz?" "Sever the anchor," Grizz growled, his body swelling, heat radiating from him so intensely that the metal floor began to glow red. "I will hold the gate." Grizz leaped. He didn't just grow, he exploded. He became a titan of smoke and fire, slamming his paws into the edges of the reality tear, physically holding the lips of the portal open to prevent it from swallowing the room. "Do it, Vespera!" Grizz roared. Vespera turned to Ilara. The possessed girl turned her head, her eyes burning white. She screamed, unleashing a wave of psychic force. Vespera stood her ground. She raised both hands. She didn't use the purple lightning. She reached into herself, past the fear, past the years of mockery, past the shame of being wolfless. She found the silence. "You are trespassing," Vespera said calmly. She clapped her hands together. The sound was absolute. It wasn't a noise. It was the deletion of noise. A shockwave of pure null energy expanded from her. It hit Ilara, severing the black tendrils instantly. The girl dropped to the floor, unconscious. The shockwave continued, hitting the rift. Grizz let go and dropped back, shrinking rapidly as the portal screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and collapsed in on itself. The light vanished. The hum died. The mountain went silent. Vespera fell to her knees, drained, darkness taking her. The last thing she felt was a wet, rough tongue licking her face, and the smell of ozone and old blood. Vespera woke to the smell of lavender and antiseptic. She was in a bed, her bed, in the Onyx suite. The sun was streaming through the balcony doors, bright and harsh. She sat up, checking her hands. They looked normal. No purple veins, no smoke. "You've been asleep for 3 days. Malachi was sitting in a chair by the window. He looked exhausted. His arm was in a sling, and a bandage covered half his neck. But he was alive. "The citadel?" Vespera croaked. "Standing," Malachi said. "Barely. The moment you closed the gate, the beasts dissolved. They were puppets with their strings cut." He stood and walked to the bed. He didn't sit. He knelt on the floor beside her, bringing his face level with hers. It was a gesture of immense submission for an alpha. "The council is demanding answers," he said softly. "They want to know what you are. They want to know if you are a threat. And what did you tell them?" "I told them," Malachi smiled, "that you are the only reason they are still breathing." The door opened. Grizz trotted in. He looked completely normal, a small, ugly, hairless, grey thing. He was carrying a squeaky toy in his mouth. He hopped onto the bed, dropped the toy on Vespera's lap, and curled up on her feet as if he hadn't held the jaws of hell open with his bare hands. "There is a gathering in the Great Hall," Malachi said, standing up and offering her his good hand. "They are waiting for the Queen." "I'm not a wolf, Malachi," Vespera said, hesitating. "I can't be Luna. The pack won't accept a wolfless leader." "Then we will change the pack," Malachi said fiercely. "Let them look at you and see what I see. Not a lack of a wolf, but something far stronger." They walked to the Great Hall together. The room was packed. Thousands of wolves, bandaged, tired, and scared. When the doors opened, the murmur of conversation died instantly. Vespera walked in. She wore no gown this time. She wore simple black trousers and a tunic, her hair tied back. She didn't need silk to command attention. She stopped at the foot of the dais. The Council of Elders sat there, looking stern. "Vespera of Blackwood," the Elder Prime spoke, his voice shaky. "You are unclassified. By our laws, you cannot hold rank." Vespera looked at him. She didn't speak. She simply let a tiny wisp of violet energy curl around her fingers. Grizz, at her heel, let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the dust from the rafters. The Elder swallowed. Malachi stepped forward, his voice ringing out. The laws were written for a world that no longer exists. The void is not gone. It is merely waiting. We do not need a Luna who sits pretty and hosts banquets. We need a warden. He turned to Vespera, pulling a ring from his own finger, the signet of the sovereign. I, Malachi, Alpha of Alphas, share my command. Not with a mate, but with an equal. He placed the ring in her hand. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then, from the back of the room, a single person knelt. It was Lysandra. Then another. A guard who had seen Vespera crush the crabs. Then old Marnie from the kitchens. One by one the pack dropped to one knee, not out of tradition, but out of a new, terrifying respect. Vespera looked out at the sea of bowed heads. She looked at Grizz, her ugly, beautiful monster. She looked at Malachi, the king who had sharpened her instead of breaking her. She closed her hand over the ring. Rise, she commanded. And the pack rose. They say history is written by the victors, but in the citadel of High Hearth it is written in shadow and starlight. Vespera never did shift into a wolf. She never learned to howl at the moon. Instead, she taught the moon to answer her. She and Malachi ruled not as king and queen, but as sword and shield. The prejudice against the Wolfless didn't vanish overnight, but it withered, unable to survive in the glare of Vespera's power. She proved that strength is not defined by the shape of your skin, but by the fire in your blood. The monster at her heels remained her constant shadow, a reminder to all that the things we fear most are often the very things that save us. If you enjoyed Vespera and Grizz's journey from outcast to legend, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of magic, defiance, and romance. Let me know in the comments, what form would your inner shadow take?